Well, an ancient discovery is shedding light on the early church. The Megiddo mosaic dates back nearly 2,000 years.
The Israeli Antiquities Authority uncovered the remains of a 1,500-year-old Byzantine church just outside of Jerusalem.
For nearly 2,000 years, the world has operated under a single assumption, that the words of Jesus Christ, every command, every parable, every whispered instruction to his closest followers, had been faithfully gathered, carefully copied, and sealed inside the pages of the Bible, complete, final, unchangeable. But what if that assumption was always wrong? What if, scattered across the ancient world, buried beneath collapsed churches, sealed inside sand-covered tombs, and carved into forgotten stone floors, there are words Jesus actually spoke, words his disciples heard with their own ears that never made it into a single gospel, not because they were unimportant, not because they were forgotten, but because someone, at some point in history, decided they were too dangerous to keep. In the last several decades, archaeologists, linguists, and biblical scholars have uncovered a growing collection of ancient texts and inscriptions that contain sayings attributed to Jesus, sayings that don't appear anywhere in Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. They exist in Coptic manuscripts buried in Egyptian jars, in Greek papyrus fragments recovered from ancient rubbish heaps, in carved stone dedications found beneath Byzantine churches, and in early Christian writings that were officially condemned and buried. The church called them heresy. History called them lost. But the ground kept them safe. And now, piece by piece, they are coming back. To understand what's been found, you first need to understand how the Bible was made. Most people assume the New Testament was assembled by careful, unified consensus, that every word Jesus ever said was dutifully recorded by his followers and passed down in a clean, unbroken chain. But that's not what happened. The reality is far messier, far more human, and far more interesting. In the decades after the crucifixion, dozens of Gospels were in circulation. Dozens. Early Christian communities across Egypt, Syria, Asia Minor, and Rome each had their own collections of sayings, stories, and traditions about Jesus. Some overlapped with what we now know as the canonical Gospels. Many did not. The texts that became the New Testament weren't officially agreed upon until the late 4th century, more than 350 years after Jesus died. By then, councils of bishops had met, argued, compromised, and voted. Certain texts were approved, others were discarded. The criteria weren't purely spiritual, they were also political. The texts that supported centralized church authority, the kind that was emerging in Rome, were elevated. The texts that told a more complex, more mystical, more decentralized story of Jesus and his teachings were suppressed. That suppression was thorough. In some cases, it was violent, but it was never complete, because the earth is patient, and the earth doesn't burn books. In December of 1945, a group of Egyptian farmers were digging at the base of a cliff near the town of Nag Hammadi, searching for a natural fertilizer called sabak in the soft soil. One of the brothers, a man named Muhammad Ali, struck a large, sealed ceramic jar buried about a meter below the surface. He hesitated before opening it. Local belief held that spirits sometimes lived inside old jars, but the thought of gold, or treasure of any kind, overcame the fear. Inside, he found no gold. What he found instead was leather. 13 leather-bound books, their pages made of papyrus, their covers cracked and brown with age. 52 separate texts in total, written in Coptic, the ancient Egyptian language that early Christians used. These were not ordinary religious texts. These were the books the church had tried to erase. Among them was a text that would send shockwaves through the entire field of biblical scholarship. It was called the Gospel of Thomas. The Gospel of Thomas is not a narrative. It has no birth story, no miracles, no crucifixion scene, no resurrection account. It is, in its entirety, a list of sayings. 114 statements, each beginning with the same phrase, Jesus said. Some of these sayings have close parallels in the canonical Gospels. Scholars recognize them immediately. Familiar ideas expressed in slightly different language. Those were expected, but many of the sayings were unlike anything in the Bible. They were strange, provocative, deeply philosophical. Some seemed to describe a Jesus who was less concerned with sin and salvation, and more focused on direct spiritual experience.
Oh, look at that! Oh, it's just coming to life. That's unbelievable. My brain is exploding right now.
It looks like it was written just a few hours ago.
It really does.
A personal encounter with divine reality, accessible right now, in the present moment. One of the most debated sayings goes like this: "The kingdom of heaven is spread across the earth, but human beings do not see it. It is inside you and it is outside you. That idea that the kingdom is not a future destination, but a present perceivable reality, directly challenges the framework most Christian denominations have built over centuries. Another saying describes a light that exists inside every person and warns that if that inner light is not discovered, the person will be consumed by darkness. These aren't the words of a figure managing sin. These are the words of a mystic teacher, someone describing a direct encounter with an inner divine spark. The church had known about texts like this for centuries. That's precisely why they had worked so hard to destroy them. But there was something even more startling buried inside the Gospel of Thomas. Something that scholars kept returning to again and again because it seemed to echo a specific pattern. Jesus, in Thomas, does not just teach, he assigns. Several of the sayings are addressed directly to individuals. There is an intimacy to them, a sense of private instruction, the kind of conversation you have behind closed doors, not in front of a crowd. And that raised a question that would deepen with every new discovery. Were there private teachings? Conversations Jesus had with specific disciples? One-on-one, in quiet rooms, away from the multitudes, that were never meant for general circulation? And if there were, how many of them survived? In 1897, two British archaeologists named Bernard Grenfell and Arthur Hunt arrived in Egypt with shovels, notebooks, and an unusual destination. They weren't headed to a temple or a tomb. They were going to an ancient landfill. The site was called Oxyrhynchus, a city in central Egypt that had been a major intellectual and administrative hub during the Roman period. For centuries, its residents had been throwing their rubbish, letters, official documents, literary texts, religious writings, into a vast dump on the edge of town. The dry Egyptian climate had done something extraordinary. It had preserved everything. Grenfell and Hunt began digging, and what they pulled out of the ground over the following years would fill thousands of published volumes. The Oxyrhynchus papyri collection is the largest single hoard of ancient manuscripts ever discovered. It is still being studied today, over 100 years later. Among the fragments was something Grenfell and Hunt didn't immediately recognize: a small scrap of papyrus, no bigger than a hand. On it, in Greek, were a series of sayings attributed to Jesus. They were later identified as an early Greek version of the Gospel of Thomas, potentially predating the Coptic version found at Nag Hammadi by centuries. But there were also fragments that didn't match any known text at all. One of the most haunting reads, in reconstruction, "Wherever there are two, they are not without God. And wherever there is one alone, I say, I am with him." That saying doesn't appear in the New Testament. It appears nowhere in any accepted canonical text, but it was found on a scrap of rubbish paper in a landfill in Roman Egypt. It was clearly copied from something. Someone, in the 2nd or 3rd century, thought it was important enough to write down. Where did they get it? The answer points in a direction the church has never been comfortable discussing. Scholars have a formal term for the sayings of Jesus that exist outside the 4 canonical Gospels. They call them the agrapha. The word comes from Greek and means literally things unwritten. There are hundreds of them. Some are found in early church writings, in the letters of the apostles, in the texts of 2nd and 3rd century theologians who quote Jesus in ways that don't match any gospel. Some appear in ancient liturgical documents, fragments of early Christian worship services that preserved sayings not recorded in Scripture. Some are embedded in the margins of ancient manuscripts, copied there by scribes who clearly knew a different tradition. The existence of the agrapha is not a fringe theory. It is accepted mainstream scholarship. The dispute is not whether they exist, but which of them might be authentic. And the answer to that question has become increasingly complicated because the physical evidence keeps pointing in the same direction. The further back you go, the older the source, the earlier the manuscript, the more ancient the inscription, the more these unrecorded sayings keep appearing. They don't thin out with age, they multiply. That pattern suggests something deeply uncomfortable, that the earliest layer of the Jesus tradition was richer, wider, and more diverse than what survived into the official canon. And that the process of canonization, the process of deciding what counted as scripture, involved not just selection, but deletion. In 1958, a scholar named Morton Smith was cataloging old manuscripts in the library of the Mar Saba Monastery, an ancient Greek Orthodox institution built into a cliff in the Judean desert, when he found something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Tucked into the back pages of a 17th century printed book was a handwritten letter in Greek. The letter claimed to be from Clement of Alexandria, one of the most important early Christian theologians, writing around 200 CE. And the letter described something extraordinary. Clement stated that the Gospel of Mark, the canonical gospel we know, was not the only version Mark wrote. He described a second, expanded version, a more detailed gospel that was kept in Alexandria and only shown to advanced students of the faith. It contained additional stories, additional teachings, additional details about Jesus and his inner circle that were considered too sensitive for general circulation. Clement called it the secret Gospel of Mark. Scholars have debated this discovery ever since. Some believe the letter is authentic, a genuine window into an early Christian tradition of esoteric teaching. Others have raised questions about its provenance and authenticity. But here is what nobody disputes. The idea of a tiered teaching, public instruction for the masses, private instruction for the inner circle, is not a modern theory. It is referenced by early Christian writers across multiple traditions. It appears in the Gospel of Thomas. It appears in the Gospel of John, where Jesus explicitly tells his disciples there are things he cannot yet tell them. It appears in the book of Acts, where 40 days of post-resurrection teachings are described but never recorded in detail. 40 days of teaching, gone. Not a single word preserved. What did he say during those 40 days? Return for a moment to the ground. Because while manuscripts and papyrus fragments can be debated, questioned, dismissed, challenged on grounds of forgery or transmission, stone is harder to argue with. In recent years, a series of archaeological discoveries at ancient church sites across the Middle East and Mediterranean have turned up something remarkable: inscriptions, floor mosaics, wall carvings, dedicatory texts, and embedded in several of them, carefully worked into the permanent fabric of these ancient holy places, are sayings attributed to Jesus that don't match any canonical scripture. At one Byzantine site in the region of ancient Galilee, archaeologists uncovering a church built directly over what may have been the home of one of Jesus' disciples found an inscription inside a circular medallion worked into the mosaic floor. The outer ring contained a standard dedication to a bishop, normal, expected, entirely unremarkable. But the inner ring was different. The inner ring, worn almost invisible by centuries of footsteps, contained a direct quotation. Words spoken, according to the inscription, by the Lord himself to his disciple. The words didn't appear in any gospel, and their content was not what anyone anticipated. They spoke of protection and preparation, of a specific place being entrusted to a specific person, of a departure and a return, of a responsibility that was not administrative, but cosmic in nature. The people who built that church, who worked these words into the permanent stone floor of a major pilgrimage site, were preserving something they had received from a tradition older than the building itself. A memory of words actually spoken, passed down through generations of believers who lived in the very town where those words were originally heard. These weren't scholars inventing theology. These were local people, descendants of a community who remembered. When you step back and look at all of it together, the Nog, Hammadi texts, the Oxyrhynchus fragments, the Agrapha preserved in early theological writings, the inscriptions carved into church floors, a pattern emerges. It is subtle, but once you see it, you can't unsee it. The unrecorded sayings of Jesus cluster around specific themes. They are almost never about institutional religion. They rarely discuss rules, hierarchies, or the mechanics of organized worship. They don't talk much about sin in the systematic legal sense that dominated later Christian theology. Instead, they focus on three things with unusual consistency: direct personal experience, the idea that God is not a distant authority to be appeased, but a living presence to be encountered, here, now, inside the self and outside it simultaneously. Specific individual assignments, sayings addressed to particular disciples, giving them instructions, roles, or responsibilities that were clearly meant for them personally, rather than for general application. And preparation, a recurring sense of something being set in motion, something being readied, something on the other side of an invisible threshold that requires cooperation between what is happening above and what is happening below. These themes are not absent from the canonical Gospels. They are present, but they are diluted, generalized, rendered safe for mass consumption. In the unrecorded sayings, they appear in their concentrated form: direct, specific, often startling. The question scholars keep returning to is not whether these sayings preserve authentic tradition. The evidence increasingly suggests many of them do. The question is why they were removed. In 325 CE, the Emperor Constantine convened the Council of Nicaea. For the first time in the history of the Christian movement, the full political weight of the Roman Empire was brought to bear on the question of what Christianity officially was. The council didn't assemble the New Testament directly. That process was more gradual, but it established the framework. It defined orthodoxy. It decided which theological positions were acceptable and which were heresy. And in doing so, it set the template for every later decision about which texts would be included in Scripture and which would be condemned. The texts that survived canonization shared certain features. They emphasized a clear vertical authority structure: God above, Christ below, the church below that, bishops below that, and the faithful at the bottom, dependent on the church for access to salvation. The texts that were destroyed or suppressed shared a different feature. They emphasized horizontal access, direct encounter, personal gnosis, a Greek word meaning direct, experiential knowledge of the divine. These texts suggested that the kingdom was reachable without institutional mediation, that truth could be found inside a person as readily as inside a church building. That idea, that ordinary people could access God directly without needing priests, bishops, or sacraments, was theologically threatening and politically dangerous. So those texts were condemned. In some cases, councils ordered them physically destroyed. Christians who owned them were labeled heretics. Their communities were dismantled. But some communities hid their books before the soldiers arrived. They buried them in jars at the foot of cliffs. They tucked manuscripts into monastery walls. They carved their most sacred words into stone floors, where they would last long after papyrus had rotted and memories had faded. They chose the ground as their archivist, and the ground, as always, kept its word. The field of early Christian studies has undergone a quiet revolution in the last half-century. Scholars who would once have dismissed texts like the Gospel of Thomas as late forgeries have revised their positions as the evidence has accumulated. Today, a significant body of mainstream scholarship holds that the Gospel of Thomas preserves a tradition at least as old as the canonical Gospels, and possibly older in some of its individual sayings. The dating debate is not fully resolved, but the direction of the evidence is clear. The closer scholars look at the textual tradition, the more complicated the picture becomes. There is no single original text from which the Gospels were copied. There is a complex web of sources, oral traditions, written collections of sayings, community memory, all of it circulating simultaneously across a vast and disconnected movement in the first century. The canonical Gospels captured one strand of that tradition, a very important strand, but not the only one, and not necessarily the earliest. What does that mean for the sayings that didn't make it in? It means they may not be inventions. They may not be late additions or pious fabrications. Some of them, a number that grows as the physical evidence accumulates, may be surviving fragments of the same oral tradition that the canonical Gospels drew from, preserved in communities and texts that history tried to erase. The words carved into that Byzantine mosaic floor, the fragments pulled from an Egyptian rubbish heap, the sayings copied into the margins of ancient manuscripts by scribes who clearly knew a tradition their official texts couldn't contain. These may not be additions to what Jesus said. They may be what was taken away. There is one more layer to this story, one that goes beyond archaeology and textual scholarship and into something more human. Across the ancient Christian world, there were communities that existed for centuries on the margins of official religion. The Gnostic communities of Egypt and Syria, the Jewish Christian communities that preserved sayings traditions long after the Gentile church had moved on, the desert monks who wrote unusual texts and stored them in places too remote for official oversight. These communities had something in common. They were convinced they were preserving something real, not inventing, not embellishing, preserving. They copied these texts at great personal risk. They buried them when threatened. They carved them in stone when papyrus seemed too fragile. They passed certain sayings orally through generations of initiates because they believed those words were alive, that there was something in them that was too important to lose. You don't bury a jar of books in the Egyptian desert and die without telling anyone if you think you're protecting a forgery. You do that if you think you're protecting something irreplaceable. The pattern of preservation, the care, the risk, the sheer determined tenacity with which these texts survived is itself a kind of testimony. Something was being protected. Generation after generation chose to protect it at personal cost, against official pressure, across centuries. The question is what? Stand for a moment in the excavation tent. Imagine the infrared scanner humming. Imagine the image resolving on the screen. Those faint letters, carved so lightly, they survived only because the mud preserved what footsteps almost erased. A sentence, words attributed to Jesus, words not found in any gospel, carved permanently into the floor of a church, built on what the local community believed for 15 centuries was the house of his closest disciple. What do you do with that? The skeptic's answer is obvious. This is 5th century theology, not 1st century history. This is a Byzantine community projecting its own beliefs backward onto a sacred site. That answer is fair. It is a legitimate scholarly position, but it doesn't fully account for the weight of what has accumulated. It doesn't explain the Oxyrhynchus fragments, written centuries before the Byzantine church was built, preserving similar sayings in different form. It doesn't explain the Gospel of Thomas, with its extraordinary textual relationship to the canonical tradition. It doesn't explain the Agrapha, preserved in 2nd century theological writing, sayings that appear too early and in too many independent sources to be simple inventions. It doesn't explain why the communities that preserved these texts were so willing to die for them. History has a way of flattening the past into something cleaner than it actually was. The Bible we have today is a magnificent document. It is also a selected one, selected from a richer, wilder, more complex tradition by human beings making human decisions in a specific political and theological moment. Some of what was selected in deserved to be there. Some of what was left out may deserve to be found again. The ground has been trying to tell us something for a long time. The jar at the foot of the cliff in Egypt, the fragments in the rubbish heap, the inscription in the mosaic floor, worn almost invisible, surviving almost by accident, preserved by mud and luck and the sheer stubbornness of stone. These are not random survivals. These are messages sent forward through time by people who believed they were preserving something essential, something that the official tradition had decided, for its own reasons, humanity didn't need to hear. Whether they were right is the most important question in 2,000 years of religious history, and archaeology is not done answering it. The church was built to last. The stone is still there, still carrying its inscription, still saying what it said to the archaeologist who first read it. Cameras flashing, hearts pounding, in a tent on the shore of Galilee. Words attributed to the Lord, words not found in any gospel, private, direct, addressed to a specific person in a specific place at a specific moment in history, and then carved in tile and buried under 15 centuries of protective mud, waiting. The question isn't whether Jesus said things that didn't make it into the Bible. He almost certainly did. Every historian, secular or religious, will tell you that. He was a living human being who spoke for years to the people around him. 4 short gospels could not have captured everything. The real question is what we do when those words surface. Do we dismiss them because they threaten a structure we've grown comfortable with? Or do we hold them with the same seriousness that the communities who preserved them did? People who hid books in jars, carved words in stone, and passed whispered traditions across generations because they believed something important was being kept alive. The ground has given us pieces of an answer. The rest is still buried. And somewhere out there, in the dry soil of Egypt, or the mud of Galilee, or the sand beneath some church floor no one has excavated yet, there are more jars, more fragments, more inscriptions worn almost to nothing by the weight of centuries, more words waiting to come back. If Jesus gave instructions that history decided to bury, what does it mean that the earth keeps returning them? That is not a question archaeology can answer alone. It's a question for you. If you want more buried history, more of the stories the official record tried to forget, like and subscribe. The ground has barely started talking.